Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Jeremy Fennessy, a cloud architect at Alcor Solutions, and I'm excited to kick off another session of this amazing knowledge-driven series of insightful talks, Evolve. It gives me great pleasure to lead this session among the global audience in Alcor family. Without further ado, let me welcome and introduce you to our guest today. Ajai Peddapanga is a principal cloud solution architect at Microsoft, with over 22 years of experience building enterprise scale software solutions and SaaS products. As an architect and technical leader, he has a proven track record of enabling customer digital transformation, innovation, and growth through technology. He has helped several enterprise customers to think cloud strategy, adopt cloud, migrate entire data centers to Azure, and innovate with Azure to grow their businesses with a competitive advantage. Without further ado, let's get into today's topic. So Ajay, where do you see the industry going with cloud computing?
Yeah, first of all, Jeremy, thanks for having me on this session. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. Yeah, so where do we see the industry going with cloud computing? So if you think about it, the concept of cloud started around 20 years ago. In 2005, I worked for a startup company, and we were building SaaS solutions for the supply chain industry. So at that time, we used to have a colo data center, right? Where we hosted our servers. And I would say, that was the beginning of the cloud. We had to deploy and manage our own servers. But what we got from the colo was the physical space, the power, cooling, and network as a service. So I would say that's kind of the infrastructure as a service, the beginning of it. And then soon after that, we had players like AWS, that came out with the infrastructure as a service, And with infrastructure as a service, right, you get virtual machines directly, right? Now you don't have to, manage the underlying hardware. And then came Azure, and then players like IBM, SoftLayer. So rest is history, right? You know who the big three are now.
Yeah, and it's when we were talking about this and preparing for the event, I look back at that time frame, and same thing was happening for me. I had a data center in a colo where we had about 40 racks of servers, and I remember doing this big project to convert that all over to either VMware or doing Hyper-V, and we reduced that footprint down to 14, but it completely changed the landscape. So instead of talking with the business team on how many servers would they need and figuring out the specs of the servers, it was really just a question of how many cores, how much memory, how much disk. Yeah. And we started just quickly building systems that way and expanding rapidly.
Yeah, it looks like yesterday, but it's already been like 15 years since we did that. Yeah, so infrastructure as a service, was a big jump from managing servers, by yourself on-prem, but you must still manage the operating system and everything about it, right? So then came the platform as a service, where you don't have to manage or patch your VMs or the VM operating system and install and maintain your applications. So instead, with platform as a service, right, you get application platform as a service. So for example, app service in Azure provides, runtime environments for Java and .NET applications. So what you're doing with the platform as a service is you are taking your code and deploying it, right? You don't have to worry about, getting a VM and then installing the software, Java runtime environment, and then putting your applications on, all that goes away. So Microsoft led the way in platform as a service. As you know, but now, of course, all the major cloud providers provide platform as a service. And from platform as a service, right now, we have gone one step further, and we are talking about serverless. Serverless means, absolutely you don't have to manage anything, and then you pay by execution. So for example, you deploy a piece of code as an Azure function in Azure, and then you pay only when that piece of code executes. So I think you asked me, where do you see the future, right? I think I would say like there are three things we are looking at, right? One is the infrastructure itself. So the infrastructure is moving more and more to serverless. I think the future is more of serverless. And another area of cloud computing, right, that has huge impact is data and AI. I think the ability to process huge volumes of data and gather actionable insights with ease and the democratization of AI and ML are gifts of cloud to us. So democratization simply means that, anybody can do AI and machine learning, and you can embed AI into your applications without you being, a deep data scientist or anything like that. So that is the power of the cloud and the AI and ML capabilities that the cloud has. So I see that, in the future, we'll see more and more artificial intelligence everywhere, from applications to mobile phones to self-driving cars. And the third area where the cloud is making a huge difference is in the developer ecosystem and DevOps. So cloud has already increased the productivity of the developers and developer velocity by leaps and bounds, but I think it will only get better, especially with the low code and no code applications, or the application capabilities, that the cloud providers are making available.
Yeah, definitely. And even this morning, I was having a call about, what a client can do with some new DevOps tooling and where they could be going with everything.
Yep.
So, we talked about 15 years ago, what you and I had seen. What do you see right now as the typical journey for somebody to get to the cloud?
Yeah. So typically, I've worked with several customers, and what I've seen is there are two kinds of applications, right? When you're talking about cloud, one is existing applications that you already have on-prem, and then the new innovations or the new initiatives that you're undertaking, and then you need to build some brand new greenfield applications. So when it comes to existing applications, typically customers take this path. You migrate your application, then optimize, and then modernize. So the acronym here is MOM, M-O-M, so it's easy to remember. We all love our moms, so everyone should remember this. So migrate, optimize, modernize is for existing applications. And for new greenfield applications, I've seen customers directly using cloud native technologies to build new applications the cloud native way. So we could actually, quickly, just at a high level, I can talk about what these two entail, like migrate, optimize, and modernize, and also the cloud native technologies. So we said, for existing applications, customers take the approach of migrate, modernize, migrate, optimize, and modernize. So when it comes to migration, right, in the migration phase, we typically see customers taking their on-prem applications and lifting them as is to the cloud. We call it as lift and shift. They do it because, especially with large enterprises, where you have hundreds and hundreds of applications, it's not practical, and it's also cost prohibitive. If you think about, okay, I'm going to rewrite every application before I put it in the cloud. So it's going to be impractical. So typically, to get a quick benefits of the cloud, right? These are low hanging fruits. You take the application as is, you take them from VMs on-prem and put them on VMs in the cloud. We call it as lift and shift, but there's a slight variation of the lift and shift that we call it as replatform. So instead of taking your applications on-prem and putting them on VMs in Azure, right now you can actually take them and put them on PaaS services in Azure. So that gives you a huge benefit, right, in terms of management, right? Because as we have seen with PaaS services, you don't have to manage the underlying VMs or anything like that. So you're taking your application and putting it on a PaaS service. For example, if you have a .NET application, right, on-prem, you can take it and put it on Azure App Service. So we are calling it as a replatform. So the another thing that customers also, nowadays they're trying is take your application, containerize it, and then put it on a service like Azure Kubernetes Service. With that, what you get is you get very high density and very high availability, right, out of the box. So you will also get some cost efficiencies as well. So that is the first thing we talked about, right? So migration. So now, once you migrate to the cloud, the next step is optimize. Now that you're in the cloud, what typically customers think about, okay, what can I do to reduce my costs? So I want to see if there's anything I can do to cut costs. So like automation to turn off VMs, when they're not in use, especially in dev test environments, and using auto scaling and adding more robust monitoring and alerting capabilities. And once the optimization is done, then comes the third phase, that is modernization. So now that we are settled in the cloud, right? Now we want to start thinking about, how I can modernize our applications using cloud native technologies. So this is for existing applications, right? And for the new greenfield applications, right? I've seen customers directly use cloud native technologies to build those applications.
And for those who aren't familiar, what would you classify as cloud native?
Yeah, so when we say cloud native, right, we're talking about technologies that are only available in the cloud that substantially accelerate your application development and deployment and substantially reduce the effort and cost involved in operations. So for example, right, you could use serverless programming model to quickly build and host your applications, or you can use container platforms, right, like Azure Kubernetes service that makes deployment and management of container-based applications so much easier. So I think simply put, we are saying, cloud native technology is something, it accelerates your productivity. And typically these kind of technologies, you can't do it on your own on-prem.
Right. Yep. And how often do you see companies modernize their apps versus build them from scratch as cloud native?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, Jeremy. And I think it depends on several factors. I think the most important factor is the cost involved, right? So if your application has a lot of technical debt and it has some complex legacy code and interdependencies, and like in some cases, if you don't even have the source code, it's easier to start afresh and build from scratch than to try to modernize it. Especially with the cloud, it's very easy to set up parallel production environments. And for a period of time, you can run both the old and the new versions, each serving a slice of your customers. On the other hand, if you have very large applications in production and then you have spent millions of dollars on your application already, right? It's simply cost prohibitive to restart from scratch. In this situation, I've seen customers gradually modernize their applications, one component at a time. For example, you can take a backend service and deploy it as a PaaS service or containerize it.
Yeah, I've actually seen that where you turn around and you take bits and pieces and you just make microservices out of the components. And so, yeah, that is an approach to turn around and tackle it.
Yep.
So I guess, how have you actually seen, companies take an existing application, running in the cloud and go forward to actually modernize it?
Yeah. So with
Did I chop up on that one?
Yeah, so I think your voice is breaking a little bit, but I hope it's okay. So are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay. So the question I had was, how do you take an existing application that is running in the cloud, modernize it?
Yeah. So with the existing applications, the most important factor is your customers are already using your applications and you need to continue to make them available to the customers. So like we discussed, right, we can just start from scratch and rebuild application, or you can kind of incrementally modernize it. So with the first approach, right, starting from scratch and rebuilding is relatively straightforward, but you need to carefully think through how you will do the production rollout. I led such a project for one of the major retailers with several stores. And what we have done is we built a new application, deployed it in production. And first we did a pilot with a few stores. And then we cut over those stores to production. And finally, over a period of time, right, we moved rest of the stores to the new application. And the other approach, like we discussed, is incrementally modernizing the components of the application. So here you'll have to do a careful analysis of all the application components and their dependencies and group them into components that can be modernized. For example, you can identify a set of backend services that you want to rewrite as a microservices, for example, right? So in this instance, you can build the microservices and then you front them with an API management gateway, for example, Azure API management, and then expose coarse-grained APIs, that are identical to the existing APIs. So that way, you're not impacting any other part of the application. So behind the scenes, you're modernized, but when it comes to other components, right, you're still using the old APIs. This is one of the ways you can go about incrementally modernizing your application.
Okay. And then from the other side of it, what suggestions do you actually have if somebody wants to build a cloud native application from scratch then?
Yeah. So, first and foremost, I would say learn about cloud native capabilities in each of the clouds and each of the cloud service providers, both in terms of the cloud native services that you can host your applications on, as well as the developer tools and the ecosystem that the cloud service provides. So for example, tools like Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, right? Those are aware of Azure. We call them Azure aware, and they make development against cloud services much easier. Whether you want to use Azure Kubernetes Service or Azure Functions, these IDEs make it much easier to develop against these platforms and deploy your code on these platforms. So you want to pick a cloud provider and cloud services that make development easy against those services, regardless of the IDE the developers use. And secondly, you want to learn about the architectural patterns that are enabled by the cloud. So for example, if you're a Java guy, right, you love Spring and Spring Boot, Azure Spring Cloud makes it very easy to build and deploy Spring Boot-based microservices, cutting down your time to market by a great extent. And thirdly, DevOps, automation, and security should be at the front and center of your in the development of cloud native applications. Specifically, now that your applications are going to run in the cloud, you want to make sure security. You emphasize security, and then the security is not an afterthought. So Microsoft has very detailed guidance on how to build secure applications using a methodology called security development lifecycle. And security is the responsibility of the whole team, right? It's not just developers or just the security engineers, but you have to come together as a team, and then you all should understand how security works, and you all should put those security controls in place and consider security from the beginning. And some of the examples of cloud native architecture patterns, just to name a few, are serverless architectures. You can use Azure Functions, Event Grid, and Cosmos DB like services, to build serverless architectures. And you can other clouds also, I'm sure they provide the similar capabilities like Lambda and AWS, right? So it's all you're using fully serverless components to build your architecture. And the other popular cloud native architecture I'm seeing is containers-based architectures using cloud native services like Azure Kubernetes Service. And then I'm also seeing microservices approach, either using serverless or containers. And then I'm also seeing event-driven architectures. And finally, the low code and no code applications. Recently, nowadays, there's so much of demand for developers everywhere. So it's simply not possible to, and we don't have enough developers. So I think that's where the low code and no code are coming into play, that actually accelerate your development time by a great extent. And I think lastly, we are also seeing a lot of AI infused applications because of democratization of AI. There are a lot of you can easily embed AI into your applications.
Definitely. There's been actually some talk at Alcor where there were some services that people wanted to create, and I found that there were already cognitive services that existed in both AWS and Azure, such as forms recognition, text to speech, that kind of, or speech to text, those kind of functions. No need to build it from scratch when you've already got the code out there, and you can just do an API call to it. So I'm going to attach the link you mentioned, the security development lifecycle. So anybody attending, go ahead and grab that link.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to add, right, we have this example called Twitter sentiment analysis using cognitive services. It's very easy to, go and just walk through the steps. And basically the idea here is, right, you can understand what people are talking about you, especially for companies on Twitter. And you can instantly know the sentiment, like good, bad, ugly, right? How cool that is, think of building such a service on-prem by yourself. It's very hard to do that. So this is the power of the cloud.
Yep. And heavily, we're actually looking at a lot of heavy usage of translation services as well,
Yeah,
because with all the languages, and we're basically working in a global marketplace, global workplace. So I had at a previous employer worked on a translation service for the HR department where people could send in a request to HR and it would translate from the native language back to English. And when the response was sent, it would reverse and go back to their native language. And
yeah,
HR thought it was outstanding that they were able to handle these types of requests and not have to turn to another person in the organization to translate
yeah,
the request.
yep.
So, with the new ways to deploy applications, organizations need to have a DevOps strategy. So from your experience, what approach to DevOps has been most successful?
Yeah, so that is again a great point, Jeremy. So for many organizations, DevOps is nothing more than having CI/CD pipelines to automate their code build and deployments. But DevOps has a lot to do with the change in mindset and culture than adopting a technology. So as for the definition of DevOps, right, as the name indicates, it is a compound of development and operations. So we at Microsoft define DevOps as a union of people, process, and technology to continually provide value to the customers. So DevOps involves three things, right? So there's a DevOps culture, and there's a DevOps practices, and there is DevOps tools. So for organizations to be successful, you need to act upon all these three, right? So I've seen at my customers, right? They talk about DevOps, but just the talk, right? Like when you look at the things they're doing, they're still operating in silos. They're still talking about you versus us. So there are no these dividing walls between the teams. So you come together as one team, both developers and operations, and you understand, how DevOps works and what are the tools available and how do you automate. So basically, just changing of mindset, culture, and then and the tools and best practices. You need to act on all these three in order to be successful.
Definitely. When you see the teams working together more, obviously that's a better cohesive unit versus certain environments where I've been where I see people just throw it over the fence and they say,
Yeah,
it's not my issue. It's now an operations issue, or the
yeah,
operations side says, we don't understand what you guys did. You haven't properly turned it over to us. It's back to the developers.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, within the same organization, people are acting like two companies, right? This whole request response process and a lead time, right? Hey, in order for us to do anything, right, you need to send a request 3 weeks in advance.
Right.
Otherwise, we can't fulfill it. So with the DevOps and Agile mindset, right, we can get great acceleration in terms of, turning out the product quickly.
Yeah. So a little bit off of that topic, it is clear, we all know that the events of 2020 have impacted our work lives. What impact have you seen with your interaction with your customers?
Yeah, so as we know, right, with the advent of cloud, many organizations have started their digital transformation. We've been talking about, I don't think anyone in the technology world have not heard the term digital transformation. It's sometimes it's overused, but cloud has enabled this. So, but with the COVID, unfortunately, what the situation we are in right now with COVID, what we are experiencing is digital acceleration. So imagine if we didn't have the remote work and the remote conferencing capabilities, right? I wouldn't be doing this interview now with you. So that's what happened during this last year. Like, I think we were going to get here in a few years, but I think COVID has actually accelerated this, whatever digital transformation is going on. And cloud has played a major role in the enablement of not only the digital transformation, but also in the digital acceleration. And most of us in the world have learned to continue with our day-to-day business without having to meet people in person. And I think that is huge, right? I mean, we would like to meet people in person, right? But at the same time, having this ability to have the same productivity without you and I having to get together in a room physically, that is huge. And as you know, many companies are already allowing hybrid work model where, if you choose, you can work remotely on a permanent basis. And I think this innovation will continue, and some of the old ways of doing business will die and giving way to a new way of doing business, which is enabled by technology. I think there is huge innovation happening just because of the events, that we all went through over the past 1 year.
Right. And what I was actually doing last year as well, I completely shifted the way I handled my team meetings. So because my team and I were all remote, we're all looking at each other through a computer screen. When I had meetings once a month where we would get face to face or get together face to face, we did bike rides. I actually took them out and we were kayaking on the water. I told them, I don't need a computer in front of you to have a conversation. And I intentionally don't want to have that computer. Let's go do something. Let's actually get outdoors. Let's be safe. And we clearly were 6 feet apart. But yeah, they actually appreciated it more, and you wanted that personal connection, at least with, somebody. So, but it shifted. I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have turned to the office and said, hey, I'm taking everybody out for a couple hours to go kayaking. They would have looked at me and said, why? There's a meeting room right there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think this also is changing the way how people are measuring productivity and outcomes. So I think in the traditional world, unless they see you physically, they don't think that you're doing something. But now we are forced to, measure something based on the outcomes we produce, not based on the activity that we do. So I think that thing is also changing.
Yep. So any thoughts on what you think will change over the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I think over the next 5 years, right, as we just talked about, now we are in a state of digital acceleration. So I think all these days, some of the companies, they may not have taken cloud seriously, but with the COVID, I think their perspective, I believe, has changed. So I think more and more companies that have not adopted cloud will increasingly adopt cloud. And companies that already use the cloud will complete their migrations. And as we talked about, they move to modernizations and building cloud native applications. And I also anticipate, a significant increase in the use of machine learning and AI. And also the application development will pivot to using more and more cloud native technologies and DevOps automation and low code and no code, thus significantly improving developer velocity. So I think the way the new world is going, right, everything requires development. With all the AI capabilities and the automation, it still requires somebody to write code to put that automation and artificial intelligence in place. So there is a lot of demand for developers right now, and there are not enough developers to handle the demand. So the only option is to somehow, you have to increase the developer velocity. So I think in this area also, I think there will be a lot of progress over the next 5 years.
And then are there any other topics that you think people should be paying attention to in years to come?
Yeah, so one of the things I noticed, and it's very interesting, is that there has been a significant increase in the development of blockchain apps. They call it as distributed apps, right? They call it as decentralized apps, or dApps for short. So I suspect this will grow, and many real world use cases will be solved using dApps. So the idea of distributed apps is, right, it's a permissionless system, right? It's a distributed system. There's no permission required, and there's a trustless system. So meaning that you don't have to trust anybody, and you don't need to get a permission from anybody in order to participate in this new distributed blockchain world. So that is changing, how we think about building applications. And blockchain is not necessarily limited to this cryptocurrencies, right? So there are several new innovations happening in terms of solving real world use cases. So I think this might be an area, where we will see a lot of development. And I'm kind of very, very curious about this space, and let's see how that goes. Another area is AI and predictive analytics. So again, we've been talking about AI analytics and big data for a long, long time, but in spite of all the usage of big data, right, most of the analytics are either descriptive, meaning that, they tell you what happened, or they're diagnostic, meaning that they tell you, why it happened. And in some cases, they're predictive, meaning that, okay, this is going to happen, like all the forecasting scenarios, right? But in spite of all the analysis we are doing, we see little intelligent decision making and automatically taking actions based on insights. So I think in the next few years, now we will be moving to more of automation of decisions and actually acting, right? You don't need some data analysts going through hundreds of Power BI reports to understand the analytics and then take action. Most of that will be automated.
Yeah, I actually do see quite a bit of, I see a lot of use cases for the Power Apps that Microsoft offers. And I've actually been working with my staff to make sure that they understand what they can do with it and to educate, people. So I see quite a bit of value there. And especially in looking at Power BI and just the ability that somebody could create their own dashboards and test things out,
Yep.
then go to a developer and say, okay, can you now make this into a
Yeah.
company-wide dashboard?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the idea behind the Power Apps is, we want to make development easy for, you don't have to be a hardcore developer to build an application, right? So we call it as citizen developers. And now we are also, seeing more of this fusion development, right? So you have a combination of citizen developers and not real in the sense like developers by profession. So you come together and we call it as fusion development, right? Where you need real coding, developers will do the coding, and rest of it is done by the citizen developers, like building some cool UIs and making some API calls and things like that. So I think this is really picking up, called fusion development. I think that will also accelerate building of applications.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in complete agreement. This is what I see, and this is where I'm trying to guide people. So if anybody is asking me whether they're, within the organization or somebody that I'm talking to on the side, I tell them, take a look at what you can do with Power Apps. So at this time, we're open for Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and post them, and Ajay and I will respond to them. So I was also looking back at, at our conversation here, and you talked about, setting up parallel production environments. Sometimes people don't understand what we can do from that perspective. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think what happened was, you imagine the on-prem world, right? In fact, like I said, the company that I worked for around 20 years back in 2005, we were at that time building a SaaS-based solution. So, the difference between SaaS and the regular applications is that with the regular solutions that you provide, right, you give a CD to the customer, they go and install it on their on-prem location and start using your application. And then if they run into some issues, they raise a support ticket, right? So there's a on-prem installation involved. But with the in the SaaS model, right, the customer doesn't have to do anything. They just have to log into your system and into your application and start using it for their business. So like Office 365 is a classic example of SaaS, right? You don't have to install anything on-prem. So we had this number of servers that we were running our application. It's a huge supply chain network, hundreds of companies on that network. And imagine what would happen. And then our hardware, we were a small company, and our production hardware, how much we can spend on production was limited. So we had one set of production hardware, that's it. So if we were to upgrade our application to the next version, right, it's like 3 days of weekend gone, right? 24 hours a day. Like we are first changing the database, and then we are just changing the database schema and applying the code changes, and then applying the new configuration and catching up on the incremental data. And it's almost like a one-way street, right? There's no coming back. If something goes wrong, we would have applied so many changes, there's no backtracking. right? So because we had only one system. So, but with the cloud, the whole scenario changes. So you have this production environment, and because the idea is that in the cloud, you can spin up your environment on demand, only as needed, you can keep it, otherwise you can tear it down, right? But on-prem, the scenario is different. I can't afford to buy a bunch of hardware just for the production deployment. So with the cloud, what you can do is you can actually spin up a parallel environment. You can leave your production as is and spin up another production environment, and then do the testing and QA and analysis and everything. And then you can actually direct some of the traffic. You don't have to direct all the traffic. You have mechanisms to just maybe divert only 5% of the traffic to the new environment and see, if how it is doing. And over a period of time, you increase the traffic to the new environment and then decrease the traffic to the old. And then after that, you can shut down the old environment. So this opens up a lot of new avenues in terms of how you think about application development and how you think about going to production.
Even when you go back towards, I know we're talking about modern apps, but even with some legacy apps in the cloud, you're actually able to turn around and duplicate or replicate the entire environment to another region, to another, set or pool of resources. And in the past, we turned around and set up some bastion hosts and had a private, link to get into that so we could test everything out.
Yep.
Sorry if there's some background noise here on my side. So at this point, I think we can turn around, wrap it up, and give some people, a quick escape into their weekend. So thank you, Ajai, for giving us your time today and answering our questions. Each of your answers were well thought out and gives us a lot to think about as well. Would not surprise me if you and I meet up again and have another conversation around some of the follow-up questions that I'm sure will be coming our way. And it was a complete pleasure hosting you for today's session. And I'm sure our audience had a great time learning as well. Thank you as well to those who attended, and we will meet soon for our next session, which is going to be on Monday, October 18th. Stay tuned for more updates. This is Jeremy signing off.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure. And thank you for this opportunity.
Cool.